Some men spend 12 years building walls so solid they forget there's a door.
Then someone comes riding down the road who doesn't knock. She wasn't asking permission. She'd already made up her mind.
7 miles of hard road, no escort, no announcement, dust on her gloves and something in her eyes that had no name for hesitation.
And then she said the last thing he ever expected to hear.
She didn't knock. She rode straight to his barn, dismounted before the horse fully stopped, walked up to James Holt with dust on her boots and fire in her eyes, and said it like she'd already decided the answer for both of them. "Marry me, Mr. Holt." James's hands went still. The rope he'd been coiling dropped to the dirt. He stared at Norah Callaway, the woman every man in Willow Creek had wanted and none had won, standing in his yard like she belonged there, and he had absolutely nothing to say. Montana Territory, summer of 1886. James Holt had not spoken to a woman in 11 days. He knew this because he had stopped counting after the first week and then started again when he realized he was losing track of time. The way a man loses track of the stars, not from carelessness but from not looking up anymore. He was not a miserable man. He would have pushed back hard against anyone who called him that. He had his cattle. He had 3 good horses. He had a well that never went dry, a barn that didn't leak, and a stretch of land in the Bitterroot Valley that turned gold every September in a way that could still catch him off guard when he wasn't paying attention. He had a life. It simply didn't have anyone else in it. That had been fine for 12 years. He woke before the sun. He worked until his shoulders ached. He cooked simple meals over a fire that crackled just loud enough to fill the quiet without replacing it. He slept without dreaming, and when morning came, he did it all again. This was what contentment looked like. He had decided. Not happiness exactly, but something steadier, something that didn't leave. He had stopped believing in the other kind. The afternoon Norah Callaway rode up his road. James was working inside the barn. He heard the hooves on the dry ground before he saw anything. A single horse moving with purpose, not drifting. He stepped to the barn door and looked out. A woman on a chestnut mare. His first thought was practical. Someone had a problem in town. A fence line dispute. A question about water rights. Something a rancher might be asked to weigh in on. He wiped his hands on his work pants and stepped outside. Then the horse slowed and he saw who was riding it. He stopped walking. Norah Callaway was not someone you forgot. The entire town of Willow Creek carried an opinion about her the way they carried opinions about the weather. Constantly and with great feeling. She was 28 years old, the daughter of Thomas Callaway, who had operated the largest dry goods enterprise in the territory before illness took him in early 1885. She was spoken of in the same breath as words like rare and refined and too good for most men, which was something people said admiringly, but also as a quiet warning to her and to themselves. 3 different men had tried to court her formally in the past 2 years. Rennick Hale, who owned the 2nd largest cattle operation in the county. A silver man from Butte whose name James had never bothered to learn. A lawyer from Helena who had arrived with letters of introduction and departed without anything to show for them. None had gotten past her front porch. And yet here she was, riding alone down 7 miles of rough road on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer heat, without an escort, without announcement. She pulled up short of the barn, swung down from the saddle in a single smooth motion, and tied her mare to the post by the fence. She was wearing a practical riding dress, dark blue, and she had pinned her hair back simply, without fuss. There was dust on her skirt and her gloves. She hadn't ridden easy. She walked toward him. James found himself standing very still. "Mr. Holt," she said, "Miss Callaway." His voice came out careful. "Is something wrong in town?" "Nothing's wrong." She stopped about 6 feet away from him, far enough to be proper, close enough that he could see her clearly. She wasn't nervous. That was the first thing he noticed. Her hands weren't fidgeting. Her eyes weren't darting. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something they have considered from every angle and already made peace with. "Then what brings you out this way?" Norah lifted her chin slightly. "Not arrogance. Something else. Resolve. I came to ask you something, Mr. Holt, and I'd appreciate it if you'd hear the whole question before you answer." "All right." She took one breath. "Just one. I'd like you to marry me." The afternoon went absolutely silent. Somewhere behind him, one of his horses shifted in the stall. The wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the property. James heard his own heartbeat, which seemed considerably louder than it had any right to be. "I beg your pardon. I know how it sounds." Her voice didn't waver. "I know this isn't the way things are done. I know what people will say when they find out I rode out here. I know every single objection you're about to make, and I want you to know I've already made all of them to myself." She paused. "I'm still here." James stared at her. He was not a man who got confused easily. He had handled cattle panics and flash floods and a barn fire that had nearly taken everything he had. He kept his head in difficult situations. People in Willow Creek said James Holt was steady as a fence post and twice as reliable. Right now, James Holt did not feel steady. "Come inside," he said finally. "Out of the sun." His kitchen table was old pine, scarred from years of use, with a ring burned into one corner from a coffee pot he'd set down carelessly years ago. He hadn't thought much about the table in a long time. Now, watching Norah Callaway sit down across from it with her gloves folded in her lap, he noticed every scratch. He put coffee on without asking whether she wanted it. It gave him something to do with his hands. "You should know," he said, keeping his back to her while the pot heated, "that I'm going to need you to explain this to me, because what I think I heard doesn't make any sense." "What did you think you heard?" He turned around. "I heard the most admired woman in Willow Creek ride 7 miles of bad road to ask a man she's never spoken more than a dozen words to if he'd be willing to marry her. That's exactly what happened, so help me understand why." Norah was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. There was a difference, and James was beginning to notice that with her, the difference mattered. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she asked. 12 years. "Do you know why people in town feel sorry for you?" That landed differently than he expected. He kept his expression neutral. "I imagine they think I'm lonely because nobody wanted me. They think you're out here because you had no other choice." She simply, without cruelty. "They think you're the kind of man life passed by. And what do you think? I think you're out here because you chose it." She met his eyes. "Because after you lost Catherine, you decided that needing someone was a liability. And you've been so careful about protecting yourself from that liability that you've turned your whole life into a fortress." The coffee pot was boiling. He didn't move to take it off. "You know about Catherine," he said. "Everyone knows the outline. Not many people understood what it meant to you." She folded her hands on the table. "I think I do." James pulled the pot off the heat. His hands were steady. He made sure of it. He poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, kept one for himself, and sat down across the table. "All right," he said. "Then tell me what you actually want." The story came out directly, without performance, letting the facts carry their own weight. Her father had died in early 1885. Most people in town knew that. What most people didn't know, what Norah had kept carefully to herself, was the condition he'd left behind. Thomas Callaway had been a good man and a poor businessman, a combination that produced very specific kinds of trouble. He had borrowed against the store 3 times in the last 4 years of his life. He had made 2 investments that returned nothing. He had paid his workers faithfully even when his own accounts were empty. The result was a debt that Norah had been slowly working against for 18 months, managing the store alone, handling creditors who were patient but not infinitely so. She was good at it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was Silus Drum. James knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Silus Drum was a land broker out of Missoula who had spent the last several years making himself indispensable to struggling ranchers and merchants across 3 counties. He found people in trouble. He offered solutions. And the solutions always eventually meant that Silus Drum ended up owning something he hadn't owned before. "He came to me 6 weeks ago," Norah said. "Very polite, very reasonable. He said he'd heard about my father's debts, though I never told a soul. So that tells you something about him right there." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "He wanted to buy the building, the store property. He'd clear the debts and give me a percentage of the proceeds, and I'd have a clean start. But the building has been in your family for over 20 years. My father built it. The land beneath it is the most valuable commercial parcel on Main Street, and Drum knows it. He's been trying to acquire that entire block for years." She paused. "Buying it from me at distressed prices would be the best deal he's ever made." James was quiet for a moment. "And if you refused him? He finds another way." Her voice was flat. "He already has." She looked at James steadily. "He approached 2 of my 3 creditors before he ever came to me. He suggested to them, very politely, that a woman managing a business alone after her father's death might not be the most reliable long-term investment. He suggested they might want to reconsider the terms of their notes." The kitchen went still. "He built the pressure before you even knew he was there," James said. "He didn't come to me with a proposal," Norah said. "He came to show me the walls he'd already built. The proposal was just the door he was offering me out of the room." James set his cup down. He looked at her across the old pine table in the afternoon light, and he understood then that the woman sitting across from him had spent 6 weeks thinking through every angle of a problem that most men would have panicked over, and she had arrived at his door not in desperation but in calculation. The distinction mattered enormously to him, though he couldn't have said exactly why. "So you need someone to stand between you and Drum," he said. "No." She said it firmly. "I need a partner who brings something to this situation that I cannot provide for myself. Drum won't push against a man who has land and standing in this community. Not openly. He works on vulnerable targets. The moment I have a husband, a real one with a real stake in what happens to that property, the calculation changes. You need legal protection. I need a marriage that makes the pressure stop." She set her cup down. "In return, I'll bring the store when the debts are cleared. And I will clear them, Mr. Holt. I want to be very clear about that. The building and the property are significant. I'm not coming to you empty-handed." James leaned back in his chair. He had expected a lot of things from this conversation. This was not any of them. "Miss Callaway," he said carefully, "what you're describing sounds like a business arrangement." "It is. Those don't usually end well. Plenty of marriages that started as something else have ended worse." She held his gaze. I'm not asking for a fairy tale. I'm asking for honesty, respect, and someone willing to stand beside me and work hard and not pretend we're something we're not. She paused. You're the only person I know who I genuinely believe is capable of that. You don't know me. I know more than you think. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, opening. I've watched you for 3 years, Mr. Holt. Not in a strange way. Just noticed the way you handle yourself. The way you treat people who can't do anything for you in return. She looked down at the table for a moment. Last winter, do you remember the Decker family? Young Sam Decker, whose father lost 2 fingers to frostbite. James remembered. You spent a full week helping them put in a proper shelter for their livestock. You didn't tell anyone. You didn't let Tom Decker make a fuss about it. You just showed up every morning and worked until it was done, and then you went home. She looked back up. Someone who does that when no one's watching is someone I can trust. The silence stretched out between them. James had not thought about the Decker place in months. He hadn't thought of it as anything remarkable at the time. Just something that needed doing for people who couldn't manage it alone. How did you know about that? He asked. Sam told me. He came into the store for peppermint sticks in February and he couldn't stop talking about the man who'd fixed their barn. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. He said you taught him how to hammer a nail straight. He practiced on every piece of wood he could find for a week afterward. He looked down at his coffee. Something had moved through him when she said that, quiet and without a name, the way certain true things arrive before you're ready to identify them. I'll be honest with you about something, he said after a while. Please. When Catherine died, I made myself a promise. He kept his voice level. I promised myself I wouldn't make the mistake of wanting things I couldn't keep. I've held to that for 12 years. He looked up at her. What you're proposing would break that promise. Norah didn't look away. Wanting isn't the same as keeping. You can want things that last. I used to think so. What changed your mind? He was quiet for a long moment, watching something you built disappear in 3 days. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. It teaches you not to build things you can't afford to lose. I'm not asking you to build something you can't afford. Her voice was careful now, thoughtful. I'm asking you to enter into an arrangement that has clearly defined boundaries and mutual benefit. What happens after that is not something either of us needs to commit to them right now. He looked at her. She looked back. You really thought all of this through, he said. I've been thinking about it for 3 months. No apology in her voice, just the plain fact. I made a list of every man in this county who I believed was honest, capable, and not motivated by the wrong things. The list was short. She tilted her head slightly. Your name was at the top. He asked her to come back the next morning. He needed to sleep on it, he said. He needed to think without the weight of her eyes and her calm, relentless logic pressing down on him. Norah agreed without argument. She stood, gathered her gloves, and said she'd be there by 9. He walked her to her mare, held the horse while she mounted, and then before she rode away, she looked down at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. For what it's worth, she said. I know this isn't what you expected today. It's not what I expected, he confirmed. I know it's a lot to carry overnight. She gathered the reins. But I want you to know something. I didn't come to you because I was desperate. I came to you because out of everyone I considered, you were the one I actually thought I could build something with, whatever that something turns out to be. She rode away before he could answer. He stood in the yard and watched her go until the dust settled back down on the road. Then he went back inside his empty house, sat down at the old pine table, and stared at the 2 coffee cups still sitting there. He hadn't had 2 coffee cups on that table at the same time in 12 years. He sat there for a long time, not moving. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and turned her words over in his mind the way you turn a stone in your hands, looking for the flaw, the crack, the place where the whole thing would split apart if you pressed too hard. He found things to argue with. It was a transaction dressed in reasonable language. People would talk. People would assume the worst about her judgment and his motives and the whole arrangement, and they would say so loudly and repeatedly. His life was organized around its quiet, and inviting Norah Callaway into it would end that quiet immediately and permanently. He found things he couldn't argue with. He had watched Silus Drum operate from a distance for years. He knew what the man was. And the picture Norah had drawn, a woman alone, managing inherited debt, being slowly surrounded by a man who specialized in isolation and pressure, that picture was real. That wasn't desperation performing a strategy. That was a clear-eyed person assessing her situation and making the best move available to her. And she had said his name was at the top of the list. He didn't know what to do with that. He had stopped thinking of himself as someone anyone would choose. Not from self-pity. He would have rejected that framing immediately. But from a kind of pragmatic acceptance. He was what he was. He had what he had. He did not fit into the shape that most people wanted. Norah Callaway had looked at exactly what he was and ridden 7 miles to ask for it specifically. He was still awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling. At some point, without deciding to, he thought about Sam Decker, a 12-year-old boy practicing hammering nails because a man had shown him how. He thought about the way Norah had said it. Not to flatter him. Just to explain how she'd come to know something about him he'd never thought to tell anyone. She had been paying attention for 3 years, and she had seen something worth riding 7 miles to find. He didn't know what that meant yet. But at 4 in the morning, still sleepless, he admitted to himself that he was going to say yes. She arrived at 9 exactly. James was standing in the yard when she came up the road. He had been there for 10 minutes, which was something he chose not to examine too closely. Norah dismounted, tied her mare, and walked toward him. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him and waited. And the waiting itself was somehow respectful. Like she understood that whatever he had arrived at had cost him something and she wasn't going to rush the delivery. "I have conditions," James said. Norah nodded. "Tell me. This is an agreement between equals. You don't need my permission to run your business and I don't need your opinion on how I run mine. We operate as partners in shared things and separately in everything else." "Agreed. No pretending to the world that this is something it isn't. I don't want a show." "That's never been what I wanted," she said. He looked at her carefully. "And Drum. I want to deal with Drum directly. I want to know everything you know about him. The creditors he's spoken to. The timing. All of it. I don't walk into things blind. I'll tell you everything tonight." "Good." He paused. "One more thing. Name it. If you change your mind at any point for any reason, you tell me directly. No managing around it. No pretending. You tell me and we figure out something else." He met her eyes. "That works both ways. This has to stay honest or it doesn't work at all." Norah was quiet for a moment. Then she extended her hand. "Those are my conditions too," she said. "All of them." James looked at her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. And standing in the yard of the ranch he had run alone for 12 years, James Holt made the first decision in a very long time that he had absolutely no idea how to prepare for. They were married the following morning. Not a ceremony. That would come later, and even then it would be small and practical. What they did first was ride into Willow Creek together and sign the necessary paperwork at the territorial judge's office with 2 witnesses pulled from the street. Because in Montana in 1886, that was all it took if both parties were willing and the judge was available. Judge Aldrin was available. He was also clearly startled, which he managed with reasonable professionalism. He had known James Holt for 15 years and had probably made the same quiet assumption the rest of the town had made, that James was finished with the parts of life that required a partner. He recovered, asked the necessary questions, received the necessary answers, and signed the necessary documents with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. When it was done, he shook James's hand and said, "Congratulations, James." Then he looked at Norah and said, "Miss Callaway, Mrs. Holt, I hope you know what an unusual man you've chosen." Norah looked at the judge with perfect composure. "Yes," she said, "that's rather the point." They walked out of the courthouse into the main street of Willow Creek. That was when Willow Creek found out. It moved through the town with the speed that only genuine shock can produce. Within an hour, it was in the feed store, the barber shop, the 2 saloons, and the women's circle that met Thursday afternoons at the Methodist meeting hall. By midday, it had reached every household within 5 miles of Main Street. By evening, it had traveled 12 miles in 3 directions, carried by anyone who had business that took them out of town. James Holt and Norah Callaway, married, this morning. The reaction divided itself almost immediately into 2 camps. The first camp was surprised but willing to consider it. These were mostly people who knew James well, who had watched him work for 12 years, who understood what he was made of and believed that Norah Callaway was a woman with good judgment, who had probably applied it here. The second camp was louder. It was anchored by Rennick Hale, who heard the news at the feed store and stood in the middle of the floor for a long moment without speaking. The man who had called on Norah formally with letters and Sunday visits and had been politely but unmistakably declined did not take the news quietly. "She chose James Holt," he said to no one in particular. No one said anything. "A man who has barely spoken to anyone in a decade," Hale continued. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that the other men in the store heard clearly. "A man whose ranch is half the size of mine with no staff, no standing. He's got good cattle," someone offered. Hale looked at the speaker. The speaker found something else to look at. "Something is wrong with this picture," Hale said. "That's all I'm saying. Something about this is not what it appears." He walked out. The men who remained looked at each other and said nothing, because what Hale had just said could be interpreted charitably as concern and uncharitably as something else, and nobody wanted to commit to either reading until they understood the situation better. James and Norah rode back to the ranch that afternoon in the particular silence of 2 people who have just done something irreversible and are still taking the measure of it. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. The road was dry and the horses moved at an easy pace and the valley stretched out around them in the late afternoon light, gold and wide and entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. "People will talk," James said finally. "They already are," Norah said. "Does that bother you?" She considered it for a moment, genuinely. "What bothers me," she said, "is the idea of being managed by someone else's story about who I am. What people choose to say about this arrangement is their business. What we do with it is ours." James looked at the road ahead. "Fair enough," he said. That evening, as the light went long and orange through the kitchen windows, Norah spread her father's account books across the old pine table and told James everything, the full shape of Thomas Callaway's debt, the 2 creditors in town who had always been reasonable men, the 3rd note, the one held by an investor she had believed was out of Helena, that had been giving her the most concern. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. The Helena investor, do you have the original paperwork? I have what my father signed. Whether the note is still with the same party, I don't know. She looked at him. I've been trying to find out. Then that's where we start, he said. Tomorrow morning. He had already decided, without quite deciding, to ride into town and pay a visit to the county recorder's office. Something Norah had said had been sitting in the back of his mind since that afternoon in the kitchen. Drum had known about the debts before he came to her. He had approached her creditors before he made his proposal. That level of preparation didn't come from rumors. That came from research, and research left traces. The morning after the wedding, James rose before the sun. He was in the yard checking the water line when he heard hooves on the road, moving slowly, stopping. He looked toward the east ridge without turning his head all the way. A rider. Sitting still at the tree line, watching the property, not passing through, not approaching, watching. James finished what he was doing. He walked back toward the barn at a normal pace and did not look at the ridge again, but he marked the position, the stillness of the horse. The way the rider sat, upright and patient like someone accustomed to waiting. An hour later, his neighbor Owen Briggs rode over from the east property. Owen was not a man who talked for the pleasure of it. He came to the fence line, said good morning, mentioned that he had seen a rider on the ridge earlier, and recognized him. Walt Prine, Owen said. Rides for Silus Drum out of Missoula. James said nothing. Seen him twice before, Owen continued. Both times something changed hands afterward that the original owner didn't much want to let go of. He looked at James steadily. Thought you ought to know. I appreciate it, James said. Owen nodded and rode back without another word. James stood at the fence line for a moment. Walt Prine. He filed the name away in the particular place where he kept things he would need later. He rode into Willow Creek before noon. The county recorder's office was a small room off the main corridor of the courthouse, run by a man named Cyrus Stublett, who had held the position for 20 years and had the particular manner of someone who had seen every variety of human complication arrive at his counter and had formed careful opinions about all of them without ever expressing those opinions out loud. James laid out what he needed plainly. He wanted to look at any recent inquiries filed against the Callaway property on Main Street. Cyrus Stublett looked at him for a moment. Then he went to his files. He came back with a ledger and set it on the counter between them without a word. 3 separate inquiries, filed over the past 8 weeks. 3 different names on the request forms. James looked at the handwriting on all 3, the same hand. Clearly, unmistakably the same hand. Someone had filed 3 separate requests under 3 different names, spacing them out across 8 weeks to avoid the appearance of pattern. He looked at the address listed for each requester. All 3 pointed to the same building in Missoula. He didn't recognize the business name on the forms, but he recognized the street. He had ridden past that building once 3 years ago on county business. He remembered it because of the sign above the door, Silus Drum Land and Property Consultation, Missoula, Montana Territory. James looked at Cyrus Stublett. Cyrus Stublett looked at the ledger. He looked at James. He said nothing, which was itself a complete answer. I'll need to understand if there have been any similar inquiries about the associated business accounts, James said. The store inventory and operating notes. Stublett checked a second ledger. He ran his finger down a column. He stopped. 1 inquiry, he said. Filed 4 weeks ago. Different name. Same address. James straightened up from the counter. He thanked Cyrus Stublett and walked back out into the street. He stood in the sunlight for a moment and let it all settle. Drum had not simply heard about the Callaway debts through ordinary channels. He had conducted a systematic legal survey of the entire property, mapping every angle of the deed history, every associated financial instrument, every potential point of vulnerability. 3 inquiries under 3 names, spread over 8 weeks, designed to look like unrelated parties doing routine research. This was not a man who had spotted an opportunity. This was a man who had been running a campaign for months, possibly longer, before Thomas Callaway died, before Norah even understood the shape of the trouble she was in. James rode back to the ranch at a steady pace. Not fast. He needed to be thinking clearly when he arrived, not breathless. Norah was at the kitchen table with the store accounts when he came through the door. She looked up when she heard his boots on the floor. Something in his face made her set her pen down. He told her all of it, the 3 inquiry forms. The identical handwriting, the Missoula address, the single inquiry on the business accounts filed 4 weeks ago. He laid it out plainly and without commentary because she didn't need him to interpret it for her. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. He mapped everything before he ever walked through my door, Norah said. Yes. She was still for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the table, the kind of flat that meant she was controlling something underneath. He knew about the debts before my father died, she said. That's what the timing suggests. He's been patient. Men like Drum are always patient, James said. Patience is their primary tool. They wait until the pressure is already there, and then they walk in and offer to relieve it. By the time you understand who you're dealing with, you've already accepted the terms. Norah looked at her father's account book still open on the table. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, my father would have trusted him. He trusted everyone. James said nothing. Sometimes the right response was to let a person feel what they needed to feel without rushing them through it. After a moment, Norah straightened, her chin came up. Her hands moved from flat to deliberate, reaching for her pen. "There's something I haven't told you yet," she said. He waited. "When I first understood what Drum was doing, about 6 weeks ago I wrote to a lawyer in Helena, a man named Edmund Farr. He has a reputation for territorial land cases, and from what I could learn, he had encountered Silus Drum in a legal proceeding once before and had not found the experience pleasant." She met James's eyes. "I told him the basic situation. He wrote back within the week. He's been reviewing what I sent him for nearly a month." James looked at her for a moment. "You contacted Farr before you came to me. I came to you 2 weeks after I heard from Farr the second time," she said. "He confirmed there might be a problem with one of the dead instruments, but he needed the original paperwork to be certain. Paperwork that would be much easier to obtain if I had a husband withstanding in this county walking through official doors with me." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "You built the legal strategy first," James said, "and then you came to me to make it executable." "I came to you," Norah said evenly, "because I believed you were the right person. The legal situation was the context, not the reason." He looked at her steadily. She looked back without flinching. There was a difference between those two things. He understood that she was making sure he understood it too. "All right," he said. "Tell me what Farr found." She reached into the folder beneath the account books and produced a letter, 2 pages, dense with careful legal language. She slid it across the table. James read it. He read it twice. Edmund Farr had located the original instrument behind the third debt, the one held by the Helena investor. The paperwork appeared straightforward on its face. But Farr had noticed something in the recording dates. The note had apparently changed hands at some point, and the documentation of that transfer showed a filing date that was later than it should have been by a significant margin under territorial statute. If the transfer had been filed outside the 90-day window required by territorial law, the instrument as currently structured might not be enforceable in a territorial court. Farr needed one additional document to confirm. He needed the certified original filing date from the county recorder's office, the same recorder's office James had visited that morning. He looked up from the letter. Norah was watching him. "Cyrus Stublett," James said. "He has the filing record." "If Farr is right," Norah said, "the debt Drum is using to threaten me may not be legally enforceable at all. He could be wielding an instrument that has no standing." The late afternoon light was coming through the kitchen windows now, long and golden across the scarred pine table, across the account books, across the letter from Edmund Farr that might change everything. James set the letter down. He looked at Norah across the table. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I go back to Cyrus Stublett and I ask him for that filing record." Norah nodded once. "And tonight," she said, "we plan for what comes after." Outside, on the ridge at the eastern edge of the property, Walt Prine sat on his horse in the fading light and watched the lamp come on in the kitchen window of the Holt ranch. He watched it for a few minutes. Then he turned his horse quietly and headed back toward the road that led to Willow Creek and from there to Missoula, where Silus Drum would be waiting to hear what there was to report. There was more to report than Walt Prine understood, but that was the nature of watching from a distance. You could see the light in the window. You could not see what was being decided at the table inside. James rode into Willow Creek the following morning before the heat settled in. He kept his horse at an easy pace and his mind at something slower than that, turning over the shape of what he needed from Cyrus Stublett and how to ask for it without creating questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. Stublett looked up from his desk when James came through the door. He did not look surprised. He had the expression of a man who had been expecting this particular visit since the last one. He went to his files without being asked. He was back in 11 minutes. He set a folder on the counter and opened it to the relevant page, turning it so James could read the stamped date at the bottom. James looked at it. The transfer had been filed 107 days after the original instrument changed hands. Territorial statute required recording within 90 days. The filing was 17 days late. Not a dramatic number. Not the kind of gap that looked like deliberate fraud on its face. The kind of gap that looked like administrative oversight. A busy office. A misfiled request. Something that slipped through. In a territorial courtroom, potentially fatal to the enforceability of the debt. "I'll need a certified copy of this page," James said. Stublett was already reaching for his stamp. He pressed it to the page, signed beneath it, and handed the copy across the counter. Then he said, without looking up from realigning his stamp, "I noticed something about this particular filing when it came through originally. The paperwork was correct in every other respect, but the timing felt off." He paused, didn't have cause to raise it at the time. He looked up at James. "Sounds like cause has arrived," he said. James folded the certified copy and put it inside his coat. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Stublett. Just doing the job," Stublett said, and went back to his desk. James rode back to the ranch at the same steady pace he had ridden in. He had learned a long time ago that arriving composed mattered more than arriving fast. Rush made you sloppy. Sloppiness made you visible in the wrong ways. Norah was at the table with Farr's letter when he came through the door. She looked up. He took the certified copy from inside his coat and put it in front of her. She read the filing date. Read it again. Then she set it beside Farr's letter and aligned the edges very precisely, the way she did when she was managing something that was moving underneath her composure. It matches, she said. It matches. She took a slow breath. James, if Farr is right about the statute, this means Drum has been threatening me with a debt instrument he cannot legally enforce in a territorial court. Everything he has said about calling the note, about the pressure on my creditors, all of it is built on something that has no standing. Possibly, James said. He sat down across from her. Farr still needs to verify it against the statute in court. This doesn't end it, but it changes the position. How soon can we get this to Farr? Morning stage to Helena. I'll have it ready tonight. Norah nodded. She looked at the two documents side by side on the table. Something moved across her face that James had not seen from her before. Not relief, not satisfaction, something rarer than either. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding a weight alone for a very long time and has just been told they might be allowed to set a debt down, but doesn't quite believe it yet. My father didn't know what he signed, she said quietly. He trusted that note. He thought it was a straightforward private loan from a legitimate party. He signed it to someone who appeared to be exactly that, James said. What happened after wasn't his doing. That matters. Norah looked at him. You say things like that as if they're obvious. They are obvious. Not to most people. Most people would say he should have been more careful. Most people haven't tried to run a business with no margin for error while they were dying. He said it plainly, without softness, because softness would have felt like condescension. Your father did his best with what he had. That's what I see. Norah didn't answer for a long moment. When she did, her voice was careful in the way voices get when something is close to the surface. Thank you, she said. Tell me what else Farr needs before he can move. She picked up the letter. They went back to work. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. It settled into the room like something that had been named and would stay named from here forward. The certified copy went on the morning stage to Helena. 2 days after it left, Silus Drum rode into Willow Creek. James had been expecting it. He was in the yard when Drum came up the road because he had made a deliberate point of being visible. He did not want their first conversation to happen on Drum's terms in a place Drum had chosen. He wanted Drum to come to him and find him standing on his own ground, waiting, unhurried. Drum dismounted with the ease of a man who had never been turned away from a door in his life. He was tall, slim, with close-cut gray hair and the kind of face that had been carefully arranged to put people at ease. Good clothes, not flashy. Pleasant expression, not warm. He looked at the property with an admiring, appraising quality, as if everything he saw was being quietly filed away. Mr. Holt, he said, congratulations on your recent marriage. I hope you won't take offense at a neighbor coming to offer his regards. You're not my neighbor, James said. You're a land broker from Missoula who has been filing inquiries about my wife's property under 3 different names. That's an introduction of a kind, not the kind that calls for congratulations. Something moved behind Drum's pleasant expression, just for a moment. Then the pleasantness reassembled itself and he smiled. You're direct, he said. I respect that. I'm clear, James said. There's a difference. Clear means I'll say the same thing twice if I need to, and I won't apologize for it. Drum studied him with the focused attention of someone recalculating. Your wife has outstanding debt, he said, shifting smoothly. Some of which I hold. That's a business matter, not a personal one. I'd welcome the opportunity to discuss a settlement that benefits everyone involved. My wife manages her own accounts, James said. Any conversation about settlement happens with both of us present, in writing, with our own legal representation reviewing the terms. A longer pause this time. Something flickered in Drum's face faster than before. Of course, he said. That's entirely reasonable. Good. Then you'll wait until we contact you. We'll arrange the meeting when we're ready. Drum nodded slowly, with the controlled grace of a man who was accustomed to retreating without appearing to retreat. I'll look forward to it, he said. He mounted his horse and rode away at the same easy pace he'd arrived. James watched him go. His hands were loose at his sides. His breathing was even. Inside, he was moving fast, running through everything Drum had just given him. The offer of settlement before being asked meant one of 2 things. Either Drum wanted this resolved cleanly, or he wanted to see what they knew before deciding on his next move. He went inside and told Norah. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, he came to see if we would fold. That's what I think. He expected to find a frightened woman and a husband who didn't understand the situation. Instead, he found you. She said it without drama. That changes his arithmetic. Some of it, James said. But not all. If Farr is right about the statute, Drum may already know his position is weaker than he's let on. Which means this visit wasn't just reconnaissance. It was also a test to see how much we know. And we gave him nothing. We gave him nothing, James confirmed. Norah looked at the folder on the table. Then we wait for Farr. They waited. And while they waited, the drought deepened. It had been building for 3 weeks, announced first in the way the grass dried earlier than usual, and the creek along the north edge of the property dropped to a level that was wrong for September. James had seen it coming and had been watching it with the measured attention of a man who had lived through dry years before and knew the difference between a stretch of bad luck and the beginning of something that required decisions. By the third week, it was no longer something he could manage quietly in the back of his mind. He sat down one evening with the cattle figures and worked through them and arrived at a number he didn't like. He should have said something to Norah immediately. He knew that. He told himself he was waiting until he had a clearer picture. But the clearer picture kept not arriving, and after 2 more days of the creek dropping and the stock pond holding but not comfortably, he acknowledged to himself that he was doing what he had always done, carrying the weight alone because that was the only way he knew how to carry anything. Norah found the figures on the table the following morning. She read them without asking for an explanation. She looked up at him. "How long has this been building?" she asked. 3 weeks, and you're telling me now. It wasn't a question. He held her gaze. "I'm used to making those decisions alone," he said. "I didn't think to. This is a partnership," she said. Her voice was even, the way it got when something mattered enough to say plainly. "You told me your conditions on day 1. Equal standing, honest communication. That runs in both directions. I don't hide things about the store from you." "You're right," he said. She nodded once. "Show me everything." He brought the full figures. She went through them with the same systematic attention she gave the store accounts, cross-referencing the cattle numbers against the feed costs and the water hauling estimates and the market prices he had from the last 3 months. She didn't speak for 40 minutes. He sat across from her and didn't fill the silence. Then she said, "You have 40 head you could move now at around 70% of market value. That would cover the water hauling cost for 8 weeks. If it rains in that window, you lose nothing meaningful. If it doesn't, you've bought yourself time to make a larger decision from a position of strength rather than pressure." James looked at the numbers. "That's the same calculation I came to. Then why didn't you say so 3 days ago?" He looked at her. He didn't have an answer that was better than the honest one. "Because I'm still learning how to do this." Something in her expression shifted, not softening toward him exactly, but opening toward the acknowledgement the way a door opens when someone finally uses the right key. "Sell the 40 head, she said. "I'll handle the buyer contact. Owen Briggs mentioned a man at the stockyards named Martin Creel who deals fairly. You focus on the water situation." She paused. "And James, next time something is building, tell me when it starts." "Understood." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back at the figures. He sat there quietly, and he was trying to remember the last time someone had held him to his own stated principles. He couldn't remember, because it had never happened before. The cattle sold in 2 days. Martin Creel came out to the property, looked over the 40 head with the practiced eye of a man who had bought 10,000 cattle in his life and had strong opinions about all of them, and offered 68% of market. Norah countered at 72. Creel considered it for approximately 4 seconds and said yes, because he knew good cattle when he saw them, and he knew what a dry September did to supply across the county. The water hauling started the following Monday. On Wednesday, Walt Prine appeared on the eastern ridge again. James saw him from the yard. Same position as before. Same stillness, the kind of watching that was designed to be noticed. Not surveillance, a message. Drum was letting them know he was still present, still patient, still running his own timeline, regardless of anything they had sent to Helena. James watched Prine across the distance for a long moment. Then he turned and went inside. "Walt Prine is on the ridge," he told Norah. She was at the table. "I know," she said. "I saw him 20 minutes ago. You didn't say anything. I was waiting to see what you'd do." She looked up. "What did you do?" Ignored him. She nodded. "Good. Drum is signaling that whatever we've sent to Helena hasn't concerned him. Or he's signaling that it has, and he wants us to get nervous and do something foolish before his next move." She set her pen down. "Every time we don't react, we take something away from him." James looked at her. "You've been thinking about this constantly." "I think about this the way you think about the herd," she said. "Every angle, every contingency. What happens if this goes wrong? What happens if that does?" She met his eyes. "It's how I'm built." "It's not a complaint," he said. "I know, I'm explaining, not defending." She picked up her pen. "Prine will be gone by sundown. Drum is testing our nerves. We passed the test by having dinner and going to sleep." He went out to check the water line. Prine was gone by sundown, exactly as she had said. It was 3 days after that when Rennick Hale made his move, and it didn't come to the ranch. It came to the store. Norah had gone into town that morning to check on the inventory and meet with the 2 clerks she was still running the place with. She came back in the late afternoon with dust on her skirt and a particular expression that James had learned to read as the face she wore when she had managed something difficult without letting it show while she was managing it. He was in the barn when she rode in. He came to the door. She dismounted and walked toward him and said without preamble, "Rennick Hale approached me on the street." James waited. He was waiting outside the store when I came out, not lurking, standing in plain sight, which was worse because it meant he wanted witnesses. She untied her gloves. "He said he'd heard about my situation, the debt arrangements. He said he wanted to help, that whatever you could offer, he could offer more. The resources to clear the debts cleanly without the legal complication." James kept his expression neutral. "What did you say?" I asked him to clarify what he meant by whatever you could offer more of. The corner of her mouth moved. He colored slightly. He said he only meant financial assistance, that he had the resources and the standing, and that the circumstances being what they were. He told you he knew about the debt arrangement specifically, James said. She looked at him. Yes, he said he'd heard about the debt arrangements. Those specific words. James was quiet for a moment. He heard that from Drum. I came to the same conclusion on the walk home. Norah folded her gloves over the fence rail. Drum gave him just enough information to make him useful. Hale thinks he's running his own play. He's actually running Drum's. What else did Hale say? He implied that my recent decisions, his phrase, had complicated things unnecessarily, that there was a simpler path available. She looked at James steadily. I told him I understood exactly what he was suggesting. I told him I had made my decision with full information and clear judgment, and that I wasn't interested in revising it. I also told him that whoever had given him information about my financial situation had done so with a specific purpose in mind, and he might want to think carefully about what that purpose was before he said anything further. How did he take that? He stood there for a moment. Then he said stiffly that he had only been trying to help. She paused. I said that help and leverage were different things, and I had developed a reliable ability to tell them apart quickly. Then I wished him a good afternoon and walked away. James looked at her for a long moment. 2 women nearby heard all of that, she said. I know, he said. Cecily Morrow will have it across town by evening. I'm counting on it, Norah said simply. He looked at her. She had mapped the entire confrontation before it began. The location, the witnesses, the outcome. Not luck. Preparation. You handled it correctly, James said. She met his gaze. Correctly was what the situation required. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, there's something we need to talk about tonight. About Drum and Hale together. I know what you're going to say, she said. Drum isn't operating through Hale accidentally. He chose him specifically. Because Hale's approach to me puts pressure on the situation from a personal direction without Drum having to expose himself. And if you'd accepted Hale's offer, James said, then I would have solved my debt problem by attaching myself to a man who owed Drum a favor, and Drum would have what he wanted without ever having appeared to take it. She looked at the ground for a moment. He's very good at this. He's been doing it for years, James said. The problem for him is that it only works when the target doesn't see the whole board. Norah looked up at him. He made an error when he came to me first. He assumed I was frightened enough to be manageable. He gave me 6 weeks to start thinking instead. And you used them. Everyone, she said. The following week brought something James had not been watching for. He had gone into town for hardware supplies, finished his business at the merchant's, and was crossing the main street when he heard Cecily Morrow's voice carrying from the front of the millinery. Sharp and carrying, the kind of voice accustomed to holding a room's attention. He was close enough to hear clearly. Cecily Morrow was telling 2 other women something about Norah, phrasing it in the careful language of concern that people use when they are expressing something less generous and want to be forgiven for it later. She said she hoped Norah knew what she was doing. She said a man who had lived alone that long probably didn't know how to carry on a decent conversation. She said Norah could have had anyone. She mentioned Rennick Hale's name. She mentioned the word unfortunate. James stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the street. He had never been a man who engaged in public arguments. His preference was to let the world talk and put his attention on what was in front of him. He had spent 12 years practicing exactly that preference, and he was good at it. But something settled in him differently now, a clarity that was not about him at all. He didn't care what Cecily Morrow thought about his conversational abilities. He had no particular investment in correcting her opinion of him. What he minded was the specific shape of what she was doing, which was reducing Norah to a question of which man she should have chosen, as if the choosing were the whole story, and Norah were simply the subject of it rather than the person doing the choosing. He turned and walked directly toward the 3 women. Cecily Morrow saw him coming. Her voice stopped mid-sentence. He stopped at a polite distance and said, Mrs. Morrow. She recovered quickly. Mr. Holt, I didn't realize. I heard what you said. He kept his voice quiet, not hostile, just even. I understand that people have opinions. That's their right. He paused. But my wife is one of the most capable people I have ever encountered in my life. The decision she made was made with full information and clear judgment. I would ask that this town extend her the same respect it has always extended her, because she hasn't changed. The situation around her has. People might think about what that means before they choose their words. He looked at Cecily Morrow steadily for a moment. Then he nodded to the 3 of them, turned and continued across the street at the same pace he had been walking before. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He did not look back. Behind him, after a long silence, he heard Cecily Morrow say in a distinctly different tone than she had been using, Well, I suppose that's something. He told Norah that evening. He told it simply, the way he told everything, what had been said, what he had said back, the tone he had used. He didn't perform it and he didn't minimize it. Norah listened. When he finished, she didn't say anything right away. She looked out the window for a long moment. When she looked back, her expression was one he hadn't seen from her before. Not the composed face she wore when she was working through a problem. Something quieter than that. Something that was working through something else entirely. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. It will make some people more suspicious about our arrangement, not less. They'll think you're performing. Maybe, he said, but it needed to be said. She looked at him. Why? She asked. A real question. She genuinely wanted to understand. James thought about it. He didn't answer quickly. Because you built something worth defending, he said finally. And you built it mostly alone, and you never complained about that. So when someone reduces it to a question of which man you should have chosen, he stopped. That's not what the story is about. The kitchen was very quiet. Norah said after a long moment, "You're going to make this complicated for me." How so? I told myself this was practical. An arrangement. I was very logical about it. She looked down at her hands. You defend my name in the street when you didn't have to, and you do it without making a performance of it. She looked back up. That's the kind of thing that makes practical arrangements harder to keep practical. Something had shifted between them in that kitchen. Not announced. Not performed. Just present now in a way it hadn't been an hour before, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, which was its own kind of honesty. James didn't have anything to say that would be better than the silence, so he kept it. The letter from Edmund Farr arrived 6 days later. James was out checking the water hauling setup when it came. Norah read it at the kitchen table. By the time he came in from the yard, she had read it twice and was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her face doing the thing it did when she was keeping something significant contained. He came through the door. She looked up. Farr found something, she said. Tell me. The note, the one from the Missoula firm. She slid the letter across the table. He pulled the territorial statute and cross-referenced it against 2 prior cases in the territory. Both ruled the same direction. An unrecorded debt transfer made the instrument unenforceable as written. She paused. Drum doesn't just hold a weak note, James. He may hold no note at all. He picked up the letter and read it. Farr was confident, more than confident. He had found 2 prior cases where territorial courts had ruled an unrecorded transfer invalid on exactly the grounds that Stublett's filing date had revealed. The administrative oversight explanation, the one Drum's lawyers would almost certainly use, was the same explanation that had failed in both prior cases. Drum's leverage was built on sand, carefully arranged sand designed to look like solid ground, but sand. He wants to proceed, Norah said, looking up from the letter. He wants authorization to contact Drum formally through legal channels, inform him of the statute issue and give him a choice. Release the note in exchange for no further legal action, or defend the instrument before a territorial judge. What does Farr think he'll do? Release it. He says men like Drum don't fight battles they've already lost. They find the exit that lets them preserve their reputation and move to the next target. She paused, but she says Drum will probe first. He'll want to see whether we'll actually follow through on the court option. Let him probe, James said. Norah authorized Farr in writing that same afternoon. They sent the letter on the evening stage and settled into the hardest part of any campaign, which was the waiting. And what filled the waiting 4 days after Farr's letter arrived was Agnes Callaway. She arrived on the Thursday stage from Billings without sending word ahead. James learned of it when he heard the buckboard coming up the road in the late afternoon, and went to the door and saw a woman climbing down from it with 2 travel bags and the particular forward momentum of someone who had come a long distance with a specific purpose and was not going to be slowed by the minor detail of not having been invited. Norah appeared beside him in the doorway. "Aunt Agnes," she said, in a voice that was exactly composed enough to reveal how uncomposed she actually was underneath it. Agnes Callaway was Thomas Callaway's older sister by a dozen years, a compact woman with sharp eyes and the confident manner of someone who had been the most decisive person in every room she had entered for the past 40 years and had no intention of changing that now. She looked at James with the direct assessment of a person taking an inventory. "You must be the rancher," she said. "James Holt," he said. "Agnes Callaway," she said. She looked at Norah. "We need to talk." James took her bags. Norah made coffee. Agnes sat down at the kitchen table with the authority of someone who had decided long ago that she didn't require an invitation to sit at a family table, and that this was family enough. She folded her hands and looked at her niece. "I had a visitor last week," she said. "A man named Silus Drum." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Norah didn't move. "Go on," she said. Agnes repeated the conversation, precisely, in the manner of a woman who had a reliable memory and understood that every word mattered here. Drum had come to Billings specifically to see her. He had been polite and reasonable and had expressed concern about Norah's situation. He had mentioned the debts. He had suggested that the recent marriage had been contracted under unusual circumstances that a judge might find worth examining. Then he had produced documents. Letters that appeared to be from Thomas Callaway's files. Letters in which her father seemed to be acknowledging a debt at a figure higher than the original instrument. Then he had mentioned a name, a territorial judge in Missoula called Cray. A man who Drum suggested might be interested in looking at whether the marriage had been properly contracted, given the circumstances. He had given Agnes an envelope, asked her to deliver it to Norah. Norah took the envelope. She opened it. She read the contents, 3 pages, without her expression changing at all. James had learned that this was what Norah's face did when something was genuinely serious. When she was only somewhat concerned, her expression showed it. When she was very concerned, it showed nothing. She finished. She set the pages on the table. He's found letters my father wrote to the Helena investor before the note transferred, she said. They appear to acknowledge the debt at a higher figure than the original instrument stated. She looked at James. He doesn't need to prove they're legitimate. He just needs them to create enough ambiguity to give a sympathetic judge something to work with. James looked at the pages. Doubt is what he sells, Norah said. Her voice was flat and precise. She looked at her aunt. Tell me exactly what he said about Judge Cray. Agnes repeated it, word for word. Drum had said Cray was a man who understood the complexities of frontier arrangements, that Cray had looked at similar situations before, that a marriage contracted under financial pressure between parties with no prior relationship in which one party had significant outstanding debts might attract the judge's attention on its own merits. James was already thinking. Farr needs to know about Cray tonight, he said. I know, Norah said. She looked at her aunt. Aunt Agnes, Drum came to you because he needed someone who loves me to deliver this message. If it came from him directly, I would have dismissed it immediately as a threat. Coming from you, I was supposed to feel the personal weight of it and lose my footing. She paused. He used you. Agnes looked at her niece for a long moment. Her expression moved through several things in quick succession and arrived somewhere that had the quality of a door being closed from the inside and locked. What do you need from me? She said. Norah blinked. It was the first time James had seen her genuinely surprised. A statement, she said carefully. Everything he said to you. The specific words about Cray, the documents he showed you, the date and time of the visit, written in your hand and witnessed. Agnes was already reaching for paper. James got up and brought her a pen. Agnes wrote for 40 minutes. She wrote with the precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime managing correspondence and knew the difference between approximate language and exact language, and understood that exact language was what mattered here. She recorded dates. She recorded direct quotations. She noted where she was certain of the phrasing and marked the places where she was approximating. She named the specific documents Drum had shown her, described their appearance, and recorded the name Arthur Cray exactly as Drum had spoken it, with the inflection Drum had given it, which she described as the voice of someone referring to an arrangement already made. When she finished, she put the pen down and looked at Norah. He made a mistake coming to me, Agnes said. Yes, Norah said. He assumed family would create doubt. Instead, it created a witness. Agnes absorbed this. Then she said in the tone of someone formally revising an assessment, he underestimated what kind of family we are. Norah looked at her aunt for a moment. Then she said, I'll make up the spare room. Agnes accepted this as the answer it was. She gathered herself from the table with the satisfied efficiency of a woman who had accomplished what she had come to accomplish, and was ready to move on to the next task, which was apparently making herself comfortable in a house she had never visited before, and intended to treat as entirely familiar. James watched her go down the hallway. He looked at the statement on the table, 2.5 pages of careful, precise documentation that had just changed the shape of everything. Then he looked at Norah. She was already reading back through what Agnes had written, cross-referencing it against Farr's letter. Cray, she said without looking up. We need everything Farr can find about him. His record on territorial cases, his financial relationships, any connection to Missoula that goes beyond the courthouse. I'll write to Farr tonight, James said. She nodded. She kept reading. He sat down across from her. It was past 9 o'clock. The lamp on the table put warm light across her face and the documents and the old scarred pine that had become, over the past several weeks, the center of something he had not expected to build. He had come into this with clear terms and no expectations. She had been equally clear about what she was offering and what she was not. They had been honest with each other from the first conversation in a way that most people never managed to be. And that honesty had built something he didn't have a precise word for yet, but recognized the way you recognize solid ground after a long time walking on something uncertain. Drum had just made his most dangerous move. He had taken the campaign personal. He had involved Agnes. He had threatened the marriage itself, which told James something important. It told him that the legal challenge on the note had worried Drum more than his composed demeanor at the ranch had suggested. A man who is confident in his position does not escalate to attacking the foundations. A man who is uncertain escalates exactly that way. Drum was more concerned than he appeared, which meant Farr was more right than even Farr knew. James pulled paper toward him and began to write. Outside, the September night was quiet, and the North Creek was still lower than it should have been, and Walt Prine was somewhere between here and Missoula carrying his report to a man who had just made his most carefully calculated move and did not yet understand that he had made it against the wrong people. The letter to Farr was finished by 11. James folded it, addressed it, and set it on the table beside Agnes's statement, which would go inside the same envelope. Norah came in from checking the spare room. She looked at the envelope. Morning stage, she said. First one out, James confirmed. She sat down across from him. The lamp between them was burning low. Neither of them moved to trim it. He's going to push harder now, she said. He's committed to this path. He can't pull back without showing his position is weaker than he's presented it. I know, which means between now and whenever Farr responds, he'll find another angle. He always has another angle, James said. The question is whether he has one we haven't thought of. Norah was quiet for a moment, thinking in the particular focused way she had. Then she looked up. "There's one thing I keep coming back to," she said. "What?" "The letters he showed Agnes. The ones that appeared to be from my father." She looked at the lamp. "Whether they're real or fabricated, he has them. And if Cray is the judge he intends to bring this before, Cray has already seen them or will. That means there's a version of this that ends up in a courtroom even if Farr invalidates the debt, because the marriage question is a separate legal matter." James looked at her. "And a separate judge. If Cray hears a challenge to the marriage, the debt ruling doesn't stop it. They're two different proceedings." She met his eyes. "Drum is running two tracks. We've been focused on the debt because that's what he showed us first. But the marriage was always the real target. The debt was just how he was going to demonstrate that I was in a vulnerable position that might have compromised my judgment when I agreed to marry you." James sat with that for a moment. She was right. He could see it clearly once she had laid it out. The debt was the visible threat. The marriage was the actual objective. Inverbated the marriage, reopen the question of who had the right to make decisions about the Callaway property, create enough legal uncertainty that Norah was back where she had been before she had ridden out to the Bitterroot Valley on a summer afternoon. "Then we need Farr to move on both," James said. "Yes," Norah said, "and we need everything there is to know about the connection between Cray and Drum before Farr contacts either of them." She reached for the envelope with Farr's letter in it and opened it again. She took out the letter. She added 3 paragraphs in her neat, precise handwriting at the bottom of the final page. She folded it, put it back in the envelope, and sealed it again. James watched her. She looked up and found him watching and did not look away. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I will, when this is ready." He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the lamp burning in the kitchen and the quiet sound of her pen moving across paper. The sound of someone who would not stop until the thing in front of them was done. Because stopping before a thing was done was not something she was built for. He thought about what she had said, that he was going to make things complicated. He had not answered her when she said it. He hadn't known what to say. But lying in the dark with the pen moving in the kitchen and the North Creek low outside and Drum somewhere to the west planning his next move, James Holt understood that whatever complicated meant for the two of them, he was not afraid of it. That was new. That was something he had not felt in a very long time. He closed his eyes. Outside, the night was dry and still and waiting. Edmund Farr arrived on the Wednesday stage. Not a letter, the man himself. James had not expected that. He had expected a response, another carefully worded document with legal citations and a clear next step, laid out in the precise economical language that characterized everything Farr had sent so far. What he had not expected was a compact man in his late 40s stepping down from the stage onto the main street of Willow Creek with a worn leather briefcase and the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had made a decision about where he needed to be and had acted on it without excessive deliberation. Farr had sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of face that didn't announce itself. You could look at him once and form no particular impression, which James suspected was something Farr had cultivated deliberately over a long career of walking into rooms where people had already decided what they thought of him. He came directly to the ranch. James met him at the door and they shook hands with the efficiency of men who had a great deal of ground to cover and understood that pleasantries were a form of delay neither of them could afford right now. Norah had coffee on the table before Farr sat down. He set his briefcase on the table, opened it, sorted through the contents with practiced speed, and looked up at both of them. "I came in person," he said, "because what I found requires the kind of conversation that doesn't travel well in letters." He produced a document and set it on the table between them. "Judge Cray," he said. "Arthur Cray, Territorial Bench, Missoula. I pulled his record going back 9 years. 31 cases involving property disputes or debt instruments. 12 of those cases involve parties with some connection to Silus Drum, directly or through associated entities." He paused. Cray ruled in Drum's favor or in favor of a party aligned with Drum's interests in 10 of those 12 cases. Norah was very still. "That's a pattern," she said. "It's more than a pattern." Farr leaned forward. "I found the family connection. Judge Cray's brother-in-law is a man named Fletcher Bain. Bain is a senior partner in the Missoula lending firm that holds the note on your father's debt, the firm that Drum positioned himself behind when he acquired the instrument." He set another document on the table. "Bain and Cray have been connected by marriage for 11 years. They share financial interests in at least 2 other ventures in Missoula County. I have the partnership records." He produced them, set them down one by one. James looked at the documents. He looked at Norah. She was reading, her eyes moving quickly and precisely across each page, absorbing it completely before she responded to any of it. "Drum didn't just suggest a sympathetic judge to your aunt," Farr said. "He told her about the judge who has a direct familial and financial interest in the outcome of this case. And Cray, based on his record, intended to hear it without disclosing that relationship to either party." The weight of that settled across the table like something physical. "That's not a conflict of interest that weakens his position," Norah said. "That's a conflict of interest that disqualifies him from hearing the case at all." "More than that," Farr said. If we can demonstrate that Drum directed this matter toward a judge he knew had a familial financial stake in one of the parties, and that Cray intended to proceed without disclosure, we are no longer talking about a civil dispute over a debt instrument. We are talking about coordinated judicial misconduct. He looked between them. That is the kind of finding that follows a man off the territorial bench. James said, "How solid are the family records and the partnership documents?" The Missoula County Recorder's Office was considerably more forthcoming than Drum apparently anticipated. Farr allowed himself a brief, precise satisfaction. Marriage records, county filings, business partnership registration, all of it on public record, all of it pulled within normal legal channels. He tapped the stack of papers. There is nothing here that can be challenged on procedural grounds. Norah looked at James. He looked at her. "He overreached," she said. "He got comfortable," James said. "He's been running this play for years without anyone pushing back hard enough to make him careful." He stopped accounting for the possibility that someone would look at the whole board. Farr said quietly, "That is precisely the situation." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, Farr laying out the legal strategy in careful sequence, Norah asking the kind of questions that made Farr look at her twice with the expression of someone revising an estimate upward, James listening and identifying the points where the plan required something practical, something outside the courthouse, something that would need to be handled before October 14th. The hearing date Farr had secured was before Judge Aldrin out of Helena, not Cray, not anyone with a connection to Drum's circle. Aldrin had a 30-year record that Farr described as clean as anyone's in this territory, which in Farr's careful language amounted to the strongest possible endorsement. Drum had been notified through legal channels. His lawyer, a man named Fremont, out of Missoula, had responded in the smooth, non-committal language of someone backing toward a door while pretending to still be interested in the conversation. He had asked for a postponement. Farr had declined. He had asked for additional time to gather documentation. Farr had declined again, citing the documented pattern of coordinated pressure against his clients as justification for an expedited hearing. Aldrin had agreed. October 14th held. When Farr finally closed his briefcase and said he would take a room at the boarding house in town, James walked him to the door and shook his hand again. "You came a long way," James said. "Mrs. Holt's letters were thorough and her thinking was clear," Farr said simply. "I wanted to meet the people behind them." He paused. "I've been doing this work for 22 years, Mr. Holt. I've represented a great many clients in a great many complicated situations. The ones who win are almost never the ones with the most resources. They are almost always the ones who keep thinking clearly when the pressure is highest." He looked at James steadily. "Your wife has that quality to an unusual degree." He picked up his briefcase and walked down the porch steps toward the road. James stood in the doorway and watched him go. Then he went back inside. Norah was still at the table, reading back through Farr's documents in the lamplight, making small, precise notations in the margin. He sat down across from her. She looked up. "He's good," she said. "He is," James agreed, "but he said the same thing about you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the documents. "We're going to win this," she said, "not with triumph, just with the even certainty of someone who has looked at the landscape clearly and arrived at an accurate reading of the terrain." "Yes," James said, "we are." 4 days before the hearing, Rennick Hale rode out to the ranch. He didn't send word ahead. He appeared in the yard on a gray afternoon with his hat in his hand and an expression that James had not seen on him before. Not the social confidence he usually carried. Not the slightly aggrieved quality of a man who believed the world owed him a better outcome than it had delivered. Something quieter than either of those things and considerably more costly looking. James met him in the yard. Hale dismounted. He looked at James without the usual armor. "I need to talk to you," he said. "You're talking," James said. Hale took a breath. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "I think I've been used." "You have been." Whatever response Hale had prepared for that directness, it wasn't that one. He reset. "Drum came to me 2 months ago," he said. "He told me about the situation with the Callaway debts. He said Norah was in a difficult position and that a man with the right resources could help her out of it." He implied. He stopped, started again. He suggested that the circumstances might be such that she would be open to a different arrangement than what she'd said before. "He told you she might be available," James said, "because she was desperate enough." Hale's jaw tightened. He implied it. "And I believed him because..." He stopped again. "Because it was what you wanted to hear," James said. Not cruelly, just as the fact it was. No answer. "What do you want from me, Hale?" Hale looked at him steadily. "I want to tell you what he said to me. All of it. The specific things, the specific times, the language he used." He paused. "Because I think it would be useful to your lawyer. And because I was wrong about the situation and about what I was being used for, and I'd rather do something about that than not." James studied the man across from him. He had never been fond of Rennick Hale, had never found much in him to admire beyond his cattle operation, which was genuinely well run. But what he was looking at right now was something different from the man he had assessed from a distance for years. A man who had made a mistake, understood it, and had ridden out to do the one thing that might partially correct it, knowing that the correction would cost him something and bringing himself to do it anyway. That was worth something. Not everything, but something. "Come inside," James said. Norah listened to Hale's account for 45 minutes without interrupting. Agnes sat in the corner chair with her hands folded and her expression composed, which James recognized by now as the face Agnes wore when she was exercising significant self-restraint. Hale talked. He was specific. He gave dates and the language Drum had used, the sequence in which Drum had introduced each piece of information, the way Drum had framed each suggestion so that it appeared to be Hale's own idea arriving naturally rather than a planted seed being carefully tended. He described 2 separate conversations, one at his ranch and one at the saloon in Willow Creek, and he described them with the flat precision of a man who had been going back over them, obsessively trying to identify exactly where he had allowed himself to be managed. When he finished, Norah said, "You understand that what you've described confirms a deliberate pattern of coordination across multiple targets and multiple channels." "Yes," Hale said, "I understand that, and you're willing to write this down and sign it." He looked at her. "I'm here, aren't I?" She got him paper. He wrote. When he left an hour later, the signed statement went into the folder alongside Agnes's account, and Farr's documents and Stublett's certified filing record. The folder was thick now. It had the satisfying weight of something built piece by piece, until it became too substantial to dismiss. Agnes looked at the folder after Hale's horse disappeared down the road. "He rode all the way out here to do that," she said. "Yes," Norah said. "That took something." "It did." Norah looked at the folder. "Drum relies on people not being willing to do the hard thing. He picks targets carefully, people who are already isolated, already uncertain, already inclined to believe they're managing the situation alone." She paused. "He made the same mistake with everyone he involved. He assumed that isolation was a permanent condition." Agnes looked at her niece. "He picked the wrong county," she said. The rain came on the night of October 11th, 3 days before the hearing. It had been weeks since there was any real promise of it. The sky had threatened twice and delivered nothing, and the hauled water had been keeping the situation manageable but not comfortable, and the North Creek had been sitting at a level that James watched every morning with the careful attention of a man who knows exactly how much margin remains. He woke at some point in the deep middle of the night and heard it on the roof, slow at first, then steady, the kind of rain that doesn't arrive with drama, that simply comes and does what it came to do without asking for acknowledgement. He lay still for a moment listening to it. Then he got up and stood at the window. Norah appeared in the doorway behind him. He hadn't heard her get up. She came to stand beside him, and they both looked out at the dark and the rain falling steadily through it, and the relief that moved through the house was almost physical. The particular relief of something that has been uncertain for a long time finally resolving in the direction you needed it to go. "The creek will come back up," James said. "I know. We won't need to sell any more of the herd this season. I know." He looked at her in the dark. Her face had the quality it got in the early mornings, before she had assembled the composed version of herself she wore through the day, the real version. The one underneath. He did not say anything. She did not either. They stood at the window and listened to the rain on the roof and the September drought giving way, and the valley beginning its slow return to where it should have been all along. Some moments carried everything that needed saying inside the silence of them, and this was one of those moments. 2 people standing in the dark, hearing the same rain, knowing the same things, near enough to each other that the nearness itself was a kind of language. After a while, she went back to her room. He stood at the window a little longer, watching the rain come down on a valley that would be different in the morning. Then he went back to bed and lay in the dark and felt something in his chest that was not quite peace but was closer to it than anything he had felt in a very long time. Outside, the rain kept coming, steady, unhurried, doing what it came to do. October 14th arrived cold and clear. They rode into Willow Creek together in the early morning, James and Norah with Agnes in the buckboard behind them, because Agnes had announced she was attending and no one had thought seriously about arguing with her. Farr met them outside the courthouse at 8, briefcase in hand, already focused in the way of a man who had been awake thinking about this since well before dawn. He shook James's hand. He looked at Norah. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready," she said. He nodded as if that were the only answer that mattered. "Drum is here. He came with Fremont and 2 associates I don't recognize. One of them has been taking notes since they arrived, which suggests Drum is keeping a record for potential further proceedings. He's hedging toward having an exit strategy prepared." Farr adjusted his glasses. "If Drum offers to release the note voluntarily before we present, it resolves your immediate situation entirely. The debt is cleared, the pressure is removed, and you walk out of here with everything you came for. And the rest of it," Norah said. "The Cray material, the coordinated campaign. Agnes's statement and Hale's. If he settles before presentation, those materials don't enter the record today. They become the basis for a separate proceeding with different parties, on a different timeline." Farr looked at her steadily. "I want to be clear about that. A settlement this morning resolves your situation. It does not necessarily resolve anyone else's." Norah was quiet. She looked at James. He looked back at her. He did not tell her what to decide. It was not his call to make, and they both understood that without either of them saying it. "What does Drum think we'll do?" she asked Farr. "He thinks you'll take the settlement," Farr said. "Every other target he's approached has taken the settlement." Norah turned toward the courthouse door. "Then let's go inside," she said. The courtroom was small and cold, smelling of pine resin and old paper and the particular staleness of a room that was used for serious purposes and had absorbed the weight of them over many years. The wooden benches held perhaps 30 people. Most of them were there for ordinary court business and had not expected to find themselves witnesses to anything out of the ordinary. They were going to be disappointed in that expectation. Judge Aldrin was already on the bench. He was a man of 60 with a face that had finished forming its opinions about the world decades ago and was not interested in revising them based on what anyone said in the next hour. He looked at the assembled parties with the even attention of someone who had seen every variety of human calculation that money could produce and maintained a consistent view of all of it. Drum sat at the opposing table with Fremont and his 2 associates. He was contained, careful. The pleasant expression was still in place, but it had turned inward, as if he was running calculations that required concentration. He looked at Norah when she sat down. She looked back at him. She did not look away. She held his gaze with the same steady attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. And Drum, who had looked at a great many people across a great many tables in a long career of getting what he wanted, looked back at her for a moment and then looked at the table in front of him. James, sitting beside her, noted this without showing it. Aldrin called the proceedings to order. Fremont stood immediately. "Your Honor, before we begin, my client wishes to convey a proposed resolution that may render these proceedings unnecessary." "Sit down, Mr. Fremont," Aldrin said without particular emphasis. "We'll proceed in order." Fremont sat. Farr stood. He presented the case in the order he had laid it out at the ranch table, building each element on the one before it with the clean efficiency of a man who had constructed this argument carefully and saw no reason to decorate it. The filing defect first. The certified copy from Stublet, the territorial statute. The 2 prior cases where identical defects had been ruled fatal to enforceability. He spoke for 13 minutes and used exactly as many words as the case required and not one more. When he finished, Aldrin looked at Fremont. Response. Fremont stood. He was polished, as Farr had described, and had clearly prepared thoroughly. He argued administrative oversight in the filing process. He argued industry practice in the recording of debt transfers across territorial jurisdictions. He argued good faith on the part of his client in the management of the instrument. He was articulate and organized and presented his argument with the confidence of a man who had made similar arguments successfully before. James watched Aldrin's face throughout. Aldrin asked Fremont 2 questions. Fremont answered both at length, which James had noticed was what people did when the direct answer was not favorable to them. Aldrin asked Farr 1 question. Farr answered it in 2 sentences. Then Aldrin looked at Drum directly. "Mr. Drum," he said, "you are personally familiar with the instrument in question." Drum stood. "Yes, Your Honor. And you were aware of the transfer of this note and the requirements for recording such transfers under territorial statute." A pause. Brief. Almost imperceptible. But James heard it. "The administrative details of the filing were managed by my firm's staff," Drum said. "I was not personally involved in the recording process." "I see," Aldrin said. He looked down at the papers in front of him. "Mr. Farr, you indicated you have additional documentation relevant to the court's assessment." "I do, Your Honor." Farr opened the folder. He produced Agnes's statement. He produced Hale's signed account. He produced the documents establishing the relationship between Judge Cray and Fletcher Bain and the Missoula lending firm. He laid them on the clerk's table one by one in the order that told the clearest story. Fremont was on his feet before the 3rd document touched the table. "Your Honor, those materials are outside the scope of the debt instrument question before this court and should not. They speak to the pattern of conduct surrounding the enforcement of this instrument and the selection of legal venues for its adjudication," Farr said, without raising his voice or altering his pace. "The court is entitled to understand the full context in which a legal instrument was wielded against one of its citizens." Aldrin held up one hand. Fremont stopped. Aldrin read. The courtroom was absolutely silent. People who had arrived expecting to observe routine county business sat in the wooden benches and watched the judge read and understood that whatever they were witnessing, it was not routine. Aldrin read Agnes's statement carefully. He read Hale's account. He reviewed the documents connecting Cray to Bain to the Missoula firm, reading each page with the unhurried attention of a man who understood exactly what he was holding and was not going to be rushed through the understanding of it. When he looked up, his face had not changed. But something in the room had shifted in the way that rooms shift when a decision has been made and the words haven't arrived yet, but everyone present can feel them coming. Drum was very still. Fremont was looking at the table in front of him. The associate who had been taking notes had stopped writing. Norah sat with her hands folded and her back straight and her eyes on the judge. James sat beside her and kept his attention on the same thing she was attending to, which was the work in front of them, which was nearly done. "Mr. Fremont," Aldrin said, "I'll hear that proposed resolution now. It took 22 minutes to formalize." Drum released the note in its entirety. No remaining obligation, no acknowledgement on Norah's part that the debt had ever been valid. The instrument was voided by the court on the grounds of the recording defect, with a notation entered into the public record that the court had reviewed additional documentation speaking to the circumstances of the instrument's enforcement and the selection of judicial venues for its adjudication. 3 sentences in the public record, specific, factual, permanent. Fremont argued for the removal of the notation. He argued that the settlement rendered it unnecessary. He argued that it exceeded the scope of the court's purpose in a debt instrument hearing. Aldrin declined each argument in order, with the brevity of a man who had already made a decision and was not interested in reconsidering it. Drum signed the release at the table. He signed it with the controlled movements of a man who had understood for some time that this was coming and had spent the intervening period deciding how to manage the ending without showing what it cost him. He did not look at Norah when he signed. James noticed that too. Outside the courthouse, on the wooden steps in the cold October air, Farr shook their hands. "That went as well as it possibly could have," he said. Agnes said, "It went as it should have." The distinction she was making was not subtle. Farr smiled at that, briefly and genuinely. Norah stood on the top step and looked out at the main street of Willow Creek and breathed the cold air in slowly. She closed her eyes for one moment. Just one. Then she opened them, and the brightness in her face was not something she was performing. It was the real thing moving through her, too fast and too large to contain entirely, and she did not try to contain it. She looked at James. He was already looking at her. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She nodded once, and then without either of them deciding to, without any plan or signal, she reached out and took his hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a small, quiet, entirely natural thing, the way things happen when a person reaches toward something they have wanted to reach toward for a long time and simply runs out of reasons to keep not doing it. James looked down at their joined hands. He did not pull away, he held on. And standing on the courthouse steps in Willow Creek on a cold October morning, after everything that had been built and fought for and quietly, carefully grown between them, the man who had stopped believing in things that lasted held the hand of the woman who had ridden 7 miles through the summer heat to find him, and held it like he meant to keep it. Agnes stood 1 step below them. She said nothing. She turned and walked toward the buckboard with the satisfied expression of a woman whose most important questions had all received satisfactory answers. Behind them, the courthouse door opened. Silus Drum walked out. He stopped when he saw them. James felt Norah's hand tighten slightly in his. He did not look at Drum. He kept his eyes on her. After a moment, he heard Drum's footsteps on the wooden steps, moving past them, down to the street, to his horse. The sound of the horse moving away. The October wind came through the street. Willow Creek went on about its morning, and the two of them stood there a while longer, not because anything required it, but because neither of them was in any particular hurry to let go. A week later, Farr wrote to them from Helena. The letter was short. 3 paragraphs. Cyrus Stublett had shared the relevant filing documentation with recorders' offices in 2 neighboring counties, as a matter of professional courtesy and standard practice. Those offices had their own relationships with their own judges. And those judges had been waiting, it emerged, for exactly this kind of documented pattern for longer than anyone had said out loud. 2 other cases had surfaced. 2 other parties in 2 other counties who had moved through the same sequence Drum had used with Norah. The acquired debt, the coordinated pressure, the sympathetic judge with undisclosed connections, the settlement offer, that was really the transfer of something valuable at whatever price Drum had determined the desperation of the moment would bear. Both cases were now under formal review. One of them involved a woman named Ruth Weston. She had lost her family's grain operation 18 months ago in what she had believed at the time was simply a convergence of bad luck and worse timing. Poor prices, a dry season, creditors who had been patient until they weren't. She had signed the papers and walked away from 40 years of her family's work and had told herself that she simply hadn't been strong enough or smart enough or fortunate enough to hold it together. Drum's name was in the paperwork. Norah read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it 3 times. Then she set it down and looked at the window. "The widow," she said, "with the grain operation." "I know," James said. 18 months ago she believed she had simply failed. Norah's voice was level and precise, and underneath the precision was something that had weight to it. "She has been living with that for a year and a half." James said nothing. "That could have been me," she said. 8 months ago, before I found Farr, before I understood what the filing defect meant, before any of this. That was exactly where I was heading. "But it wasn't you," he said. "It was someone." She looked at him. "It was Ruth Weston, and there were probably others before her. And the reason it wasn't me is that I had the right information at the right time and the right—" She stopped. "The right husband," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The word sat between them differently than it had before. Not the word of a legal arrangement. Not the word of a partnership with defined terms. The word as it actually was between 2 people who had been through something together and come out the other side, still wanting to be in the same room. "I'm going to write to her," Norah said. "To Ruth Weston. I want her to know what happened. I want her to know about the filing statute and about Farr and about what Aldrin put in the record. I want her to understand that she wasn't foolish. She wasn't weak. She was targeted by someone who was very good at making targeted people feel like they had simply failed. Far can help with that, James said. I'll ask him. She nodded. She reached for paper and began writing before he had finished the sentence, because that was what she did. She turned the end of one thing directly into the beginning of the next, without fanfare and without waiting for permission, and James had come to understand that this quality of hers was not ambition exactly, and not restlessness exactly, but something closer to the refusal to let a moment of capacity go unused when there was still something that needed doing. He watched her write, and something arrived in him quietly, without announcement, the way his most certain thoughts always came, not with drama or with the particular self-consciousness of a man who is aware he is having an important realization. Just as a fact, settling into place the way facts do when they have been true for a while and you have finally stopped moving fast enough to notice them. He loved her, not because she had ridden 7 miles and said something impossible in his yard, not because she was the most admired woman in Willow Creek, not because of any of the parts of her that the world could see and approve of and assign value to in the ordinary social accounting of a small frontier town. He loved her because she was sitting at his kitchen table writing a letter to a widow she had never met, about an injustice that no longer threatened her personally, because she had decided that the capacity to help was sufficient reason to help and no other justification was required. He loved her because that was just what she did, that was just who she was. And he had watched her be exactly that person every day for 2 months, in the small moments and the large ones, in the kitchen in the early mornings and in the courthouse on the hard days, and the accumulation of all those moments had built something in him that he had not been prepared for and could not now imagine being without. He had been alone for 12 years. He had believed with the conviction of a man who had been burned badly enough to mean it, that wanting things that lasted was a liability he could not afford, that the cost of losing something you had allowed yourself to need was higher than the value of having it in the first place. Sitting across from Norah Callaway Holt on a November morning, with the record of Drum's defeat on the table between them and her pen moving steadily across the page of a letter to someone she had never met, he understood with complete clarity that he had been wrong. He had not been protecting himself from loss. He had been waiting for something worth the risk of it. He hadn't known that until now. But now he knew it the way he knew everything that was genuinely true, in his chest, in his hands, with the same settled certainty he brought to honest work and kept promises and the particular quality of the September light over the Bitterroot Valley. Norah, he said. She looked up. He had not planned this. There was nothing prepared, no language worked out in advance, because he was not that kind of man and this was not that kind of moment. What it was real. And real didn't wait for preparation. I need to say something to you, he said. She set her pen down. She gave him her full attention the way she always did, completely and without fraction, as if whatever he was about to say was the only thing in the room. When you came to me, he said, you told me you had been watching how I treated people when I thought no one was paying attention, that it told you more about me than anything else could have. He paused. I've been thinking about that, because the same thing is true in the other direction. She didn't move. I've watched you every day for 2 months, he said. I've watched you work and think and fight for something that was yours, and then turn around and think about how to help someone you've never met. I've watched you be honest when it would have been easier not to be. I've watched you hold things together when any reasonable person would have let them fall apart. He looked at her across the table. I didn't come into this expecting anything. You were clear about what the terms were, and I accepted them because they were fair. James, let me finish. She was still. The terms were fair, he said, but they weren't what happened. What happened is that I'm in love with you. And I'm not saying that to change the arrangement or to ask you for anything you haven't decided to give. I'm saying it because I told you on the first day that this has to stay honest or it doesn't work at all. And me not saying this would be the least honest thing I've done in 12 years. The kitchen was absolutely still. Norah looked at him. Her expression was doing something he had not seen from her before. Not the composure she wore over everything. Not the sharpness she brought to problems. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been there for a while, he thought, waiting for the door to open. You're telling me, she said slowly, that you're in love with me, and you're not asking me for anything in return. I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give. She was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of something being worked through. Do you know, she said, how long it has been since someone told me the truth without needing something from me for it? He didn't answer. It wasn't a question she needed him to answer. I came to you with a transaction, she said. That was real. I meant every word of it. I was not being dishonest with you. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. But I was not being entirely honest with myself about why your name was the only one I was seriously considering. There were other men with land and standing who might have agreed to the arrangement. I didn't go to them. She held his gaze. I came to you, she said, because from 3 years of watching I already knew that I would rather be in a difficult situation with you than in a comfortable one with anyone else. I told myself it was pragmatic. I told myself it was about character and reliability and the specific qualities I needed in a partner for this particular problem. She paused. It was also that I wanted it to be you. And I wasn't ready to say that out loud until you just did. James stood up. He came around the table. He put his hand out. She took it. He drew her to her feet, and she came without hesitation. And when she was standing in front of him, she looked up at him with the most unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face. All of the composure set down. All of the management released. Just Norah. The real version, the one that had always been there, underneath everything the world saw, underneath the capable and the relentless and the extraordinary. He kissed her. Not tentatively, not as a question, but the way a man kisses someone when he has finally arrived somewhere he didn't know he had been looking for. She kissed him back the same way. The wedding celebration was held on the 15th of November. Norah organized it, which meant it was exactly what it needed to be and nothing it didn't. She rented the Methodist meeting hall, arranged food through the women who had been her father's regular customers for 20 years, ordered flowers from a woman in town who grew them under glass and was glad for the November business. She did not make it large, she made it real. About 60 people came. Owen Briggs and his wife, who had been quietly certain about this outcome for some time, and had the satisfied manner of people whose assessments have been vindicated. Cyrus Stublett, who arrived early and stood near the wall with a glass of cider and the expression of a man who has done something small and right and found that sufficient. Edmund Farr, who had come from Helena without being asked and who, when James raised an eyebrow at his presence, said only that he had wanted to see how the story ended. Agnes, who had returned from Billings on the Wednesday stage, also without being asked, and was moving through the room with the proprietary ease of someone who had decided this was family and was acting accordingly. Cecily Morrow came with her husband, who shook James's hand with genuine warmth. Cecily had attended 2 Thursday circle meetings with Norah since the courthouse, and whatever had shifted between them in that time had shifted quietly and appeared to be holding. Sam Decker came with his father, Tom, whose missing fingers had healed the way most real healing goes, imperfectly but functionally. Sam was 13 now and had grown 2 inches since winter and still apparently thought about nails, because the first thing he said to James was that he had helped his father build a new root cellar and every nail had gone in straight. James told him that was the correct outcome of practice. Sam looked profoundly satisfied with this assessment. Rennick Hale did not come. He had sent a note 2 weeks earlier, brief and correctly worded, expressing his good wishes for the occasion. Norah read it and said he meant it, which was a more generous reading than James had arrived at independently, and probably more accurate. Reverend Alcott spoke toward the end of the evening when the food was mostly gone and the conversations had broken into the smaller, warmer kind that happen when people stop performing for the occasion and start simply talking. He didn't offer a formal ceremony. They were already married, thoroughly and legally, with Aldrin's court record attached and everything else that went with it. What he offered was something else. A witnessing, an acknowledgement of what he had observed over the months since a woman had ridden 7 miles on a summer afternoon to ask an impossible question of a man who had forgotten he was still the kind of person who could be asked. He said he had watched 2 people who had each decided, for different reasons and in different ways, that needing someone was a risk they could not afford. He said he had watched that decision get revised, not in a single dramatic moment, not in a declaration or a gesture, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. Shared work, shared difficulty, shared mornings at a kitchen table with coffee and ledgers, and the particular quiet of people who have decided to trust each other and are finding out what that actually means in practice, day by day, in the small choices that nobody watches. He said the loneliest man in this county did not become less lonely because a remarkable woman chose him. He became less lonely because he chose to let himself be chosen. There was a difference, the Reverend said. The first was luck. The second was courage. He looked at James when he said that. James held his gaze. He did not disagree. Agnes made a sound near the side wall that she would have described, if asked, as a cough. Everyone within earshot correctly identified it as something else and chose not to comment. Later, when the celebration had quieted and most people had eaten and the room had settled into that comfortable final register of a good evening winding down, Norah found James near the door. He was watching the room, not the way he used to watch rooms from the outside, assessing from a distance and deciding whether the distance was preferable. He was watching it the way a person watches something they belong to. She came to stand beside him. Reverend Alcott called you courageous, she said. He was being generous. I don't think so. She looked at him. You agreed to something you had no reason to trust with a woman you had spoken 12 words to on 24 hours of deliberation. That's not calculation. That's trust extended before the evidence was in. He looked at her. You weren't a risk I was afraid of. No, I was afraid of wanting it and then losing it. That's different. He looked at the room, at Agnes talking to Farr with the focused intensity of a woman who had decided he was interesting, at Sam Decker carefully eating a piece of cake, at Owen Briggs laughing at something his wife had said. You were the clearest thing I had seen in a long time. You rode up that road and you said the most impossible thing and every part of you was completely present when you said it. No performance, no strategy. He shook his head slightly. I didn't know yet what you wanted, but I knew exactly who you were. You don't walk away from that. Norah was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her face, not the controlled expressions she had worn through the hard months, not the brightness of the courthouse steps, but something deeper and steadier than either. The kind of feeling that doesn't need to perform itself because it has nowhere else it needs to be. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "When I made my list," she said, "the list of honest men in this county, it wasn't 3 names. It wasn't 5. She met his eyes. It was 1. It was always only ever 1. I made it a list so that it would feel like a rational process." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not a rational process. James looked at her. "You rode 7 miles, he said. "Through the summer heat," she confirmed. "Alone, because you were not willing to let me disappear into that ranch without at least asking the question." She looked up at him with the directness she brought to everything that mattered. "I was not willing," she said, "to spend the rest of my life watching a good man vanish into a valley because neither of us was brave enough to say the obvious thing out loud." He reached out and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his. They stood there together in the warmth of the room with 60 people and the Reverend and Agnes and young Sam Decker and a lawyer from Helena who had come all this way to see how the story ended. All of it surrounding them without intruding, the way the world sometimes manages to get the proportion right and holds back just far enough to let a real moment be what it is. The following morning they were up before the sun, not because anything was wrong, not because something needed managing, because that was what they both were, and the life they had built together ran on early mornings and honest work and coffee at the old pine table before the light came fully up. James went out to check the North Creek before breakfast. He pulled on his coat in the dark entryway and stepped out into the cold November air. The sky was still gray and the frost was on the ground, and the valley was quiet in the way it got before dawn. Not the emptiness of night, but the gathering stillness of something preparing to begin again. The kind of quiet that isn't absence, but anticipation. He walked out toward the creek line and stood at the bank and listened to it running. Full and clear and untroubled, every inch of what the dry season had taken returned by the November rains, as if the land itself had been waiting for the right conditions to restore what had always been there. He heard the porch door behind him. Then he felt the weight of his heavier coat being placed over his shoulders, the one he had not thought to take from the hook. He didn't turn around. He heard the door close again. He stood for a moment with the coat on his shoulders and the cold on his face and the creek running full below him. He stood and listened to it and let himself understand what he was standing inside. 12 years he had been on this land. He had worked it alone and built it honestly and told himself that the quiet was sufficient, that it was the shape of a life and not an absence, that a man who expected nothing was protected from the particular devastation of losing it. He had been wrong about that. Not about the land or the work or the honest life he had built here, but about the quiet. He had called it peace when it was something else. He had called it enough when he had no basis for comparison. Sufficient did not look like this. Sufficient did not feel like a coat appearing on your shoulders in the cold before you thought to reach for it yourself. Sufficient did not sound like a voice in the kitchen when you came through the door, or carry the weight of a lamp in a window you could see from the far pasture on a dark November evening, or arrive on a summer Tuesday in a dark blue riding dress with dust on the gloves and a question that changed everything. He knew the difference now. He would not confuse them again. He went back inside. Norah was at the table. The lamp was on and the coffee was made and she was already working, 'cause she was always already working, and she looked up when he came through the door with the expression she had for him now, the one that was just hers, the one that had no performance in it at all and no distance and nothing held back. He sat down across from her. She poured him coffee without being asked and slid it across the table and went back to what she was reading. He picked up the cup. The coffee was hot. Outside the November light was beginning, slow and gold and unhurried, coming up over the Bitterroot Valley the way it always had. The way it had come up over this land for years before he arrived and would keep coming up long after. But this morning someone was watching it. 2 people at an old pine table in a kitchen that had held one voice for 12 years and now held 2, working in the morning quiet in the particular piece of people who know each other truly, where nothing important goes unsaid and nothing real needs to be performed, and the silence between them is not empty but full, the way silence gets when it has something to hold. James Holt had stopped believing in things that lasted. He had ridden out every morning for 12 years into a valley that turned gold in September and told himself that was enough. He had kept his promises to the dead and his distance from the living and his hands busy and his expectations low and called all of it wisdom. And then a woman had ridden 7 miles through the summer heat and said the most impossible thing he had ever heard, and she had said it looking directly at him, without flinching, without apology, with the calm certainty of someone who has done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer she intends to stand behind. And he had been wrong about everything. In the morning light of that November kitchen, with Norah across the table and the North Creek running full outside, and the life they had built surrounding them on every side, built from a handshake and a list of one name and 7 miles of summer road and 2 months of honest work and the particular courage of 2 people who had each decided, separately and then together, that the risk of wanting something real was worth whatever it might cost, he knew it with the same certainty he brought to everything that mattered. He picked up his cup, she turned a page. The light came up over the valley, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was what enough had always meant when you finally let yourself find out.